Thank you all for joining us today. This actually is my first time at South by Southwest, and I'm having a wonderful time. I'm so engaged by the energy, the diversity of ideas, the excitement and free thinking, and that we hope to continue that. And we think that our session will tap into that as we talk about collaboration to achieve sustainable access models to innovative medicines. My name is Mark Lanasa. I'm a physician, a medical oncologist by training. My role is that I'm the Chief Medical Officer for Solid Tumors at BeiGene. We're actually in the middle of a name change, so we will be called B1 Medicines. And I have been working in the pharmaceutical industry for about 12 years. Before that, I was a practicing medical oncologist in academia. I practiced at Duke University in Durham, North Carolina, in medical oncology for about 7 years. And what I can say is that I have spent my approximately 20-year career totally focused on the development of innovative medicines for patients with cancer. And the good news that I'm here to share with you is that there's been tremendous technological progress, that we've seen an absolute transformation in the care of patients with cancer with the advent of immunotherapy, with targeted therapies. It's totally changed from when I was a clinical trainee and we were giving chemotherapy-based regimens to almost everybody. Now, the less good news is that the ability to provide these innovative medicines, to have access and distribution chains, has not kept pace with the rate of change. And therefore, more change is needed to enable that. And luckily, I have two people with me today who are joining us from organizations that are helping to upend that traditional distribution model. Pat Garcia-Gonzalez from the Max Foundation, Jeff Allen from Friends of Cancer Research. So to start, Pat and Jeff, I think that the work that your organizations are doing is so impactful, but the audience might not be deeply familiar with your organizations. Can you tell us a little bit about the work and the impact of your organization? And Pat, maybe you can start us off.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you for South by to inviting us and for BeiGene. So I do have to say that today is a very special day for me. Today it marks the 34-year tragic anniversary of the day that Max passed away. He was 17, he was my stepson, right here in Houston at MD Anderson. So it's very special to me, for me to be here today. And, you know, we started the Max Foundation, honestly, because that day when the doctor said it was over and we had to go home, we just could not accept. We could not accept that it was over. And so we started this little organization and we opened an email address, help@themaxfoundation.org. And immediately we started receiving emails from people all over the world who had a very similar situation. They were told they had some cancer. They were told there was a medicine. And then they were told this medicine was not in their country. And they were desperate to help, to get help to access this medicine. And, you know, Max had a type of leukemia that's called chronic myeloid leukemia. And at the time, there was really no good treatment for Max when he was sick. But 10 years later, an innovative medicine came to the market that turned the leukemia he had into a chronic illness that, you know, with a pill that you had to take every day, you could be well for many years. And we were lucky to be invited by the company that made this medicine to bring it to patients around the world that in places where this medicine would not be available. Because that's the first thing I learned when I started working in this field, is that something I didn't know, that probably most people don't know. All these medicines you see that come to the market, that you see all the advertising in the TV, will never reach patients in half the countries of the world. And so, you know, for many, many reasons, and so in this situation with this medicine, the company said that the company thought there were 80 countries where they would never commercialize this drug, but there would be patients that needed it, and that's how we engage with them to try to bring it to patients in these countries that needed it. And so we started receiving requests from physicians in all these countries, and we started actually writing them in some yellow pad of paper and trying to track these cases. And then we went to Excel. We started working on Excel. But of course, after we had like 100 patients, it was very hard to keep track of the treatment of each patient. So, one of the most important things we did early on in 2003 was to hire a young kid right out of college that had just finished his degree in computer science, super smart. At the time, he had received, offers to work in Google and Netflix and whatever, but he had lost his best friend in high school to leukemia, and he wanted to make a difference. So he came to work with us, and he designed a web access program where we could track the treatment of thousands of patients at a time in partnership with their treating physicians. And this system allows us to make sure we don't lose track of all the cases. So, in the last 20 years, now we're tracking the treatment of more than 100,000 patients in about 70-some countries in partnership with about 500 physicians. So it's been a journey, and I think that, high tech meets low tech in low and middle income countries, and we've been able to do this.
It's incredible. Thank you. And Jeff, could you tell us a bit more about Friends?
Sure. Hi, thanks for the invitation to be here. It is also my first time at the meeting. My name's Jeff Allen. I'm the president and CEO of an organization called Friends of Cancer Research in Washington, D.C. We're a policy and advocacy organization. So what that essentially means is we are a nonprofit organization, and our mission is quite simple. It's really trying to use the science that we fund and the policies that we work on to increase the speed at which new medicines are available to people who need them. Obviously, by our name, we predominantly focus on cancer medicines. But oftentimes the policies that are shaping healthcare are not necessarily tailored to cancer, which is fine. But I think whether you're examining the future of cancer research or many other serious illnesses, there's a lot of things that need to be brought together in order to be successful. My background's in molecular biology, and I remember when I was still at the research bench trying to identify new potential drug targets, just how long it takes in order to actually turn into a new medicine. Some of the proteins that I was researching in grad school, it was 10 years later that they actually became available and marketed drugs. And there's good reasons for some of that, but it doesn't necessarily need to always be the case. And even more so, from the policy side of things, the science is evolving so quickly in fields like oncology with entirely new modes of treatment and different ways to target cancer cells and stop their unregulated growth. And while that is its own scientific process, it's really constrained by the policies that are associated with getting new drugs to patients. The area that we focus in most is with the Food and Drug Administration. So any new cancer medicine needs to go through a series of testing and reviewed by the experts at the FDA. But oftentimes the policies that have been set up to guide drug development for many, many decades are not necessarily reflective of the science that's available today. And that's where we focus through the projects that we're able to fund, looking at ways of bringing the different systems together that are needed to successfully develop new medicines in a way that is most conducive to the people who need it, not necessarily doing things just because that's the way they've always been done. And having spent a good portion of my career in academic medicine, I certainly can see that our universities around the country and around the world are the engines of discovery. They're a vital component, but they aren't necessarily set up to see a new discovery make it all the way to the people who need them. So I hope that that's what we're able to provide, is trying to engineer the systems that are needed from a policy perspective to make sure that our policies are reflective of the state of science, so that these promising new breakthroughs are able to reach the people who need them most.
Great. Thank you both. So I think one of the messages that we wanted to highlight today is that really no single organization has both the resources or the capacity to address this multifaceted problem related to distribution and access. And therefore, collaboration is really essential. It can leverage the strengths of both private and public organizations, both for-profit organizations and not-for-profit organizations. So for example, one of our initiatives that we have at Beijing is our new Access to Cancer Care initiative, which is a grant funding organization. And some of our inaugural grants went to the cancer support community, which is based where I live in Washington, D.C. Also with the Abrale organization, which is a patient support organization in Brazil. And we have also provided grants to organizations in Thailand and in South Africa. So, Jeff, could you tell us a little bit more about the really important work that Friends has done? Because Friends has really been integral in accelerating access to medications, particularly here in the United States.
Sure. In Mark's opening comments, he mentioned how for many different cancers, there's different types of treatments that have now become a reality. Things that are able to modulate the immune system, for example, or the identification of certain targets that are unique to a cancer cell, that if a drug is designed toward that, can target just those individual cells, the ones that are harmful or growing out of control, but hopefully leave those normal cells alone and be able to essentially eradicate the cancer. This wasn't always the case, several decades ago, where a more general chemotherapy was needed to treat most cancers. But what was really happening as these new agents were being discovered is they were subject to the same laws. They were subject to the same processes in order to guide their development. And on average, it was taking 10 to 12 years for a new discovery to be able to make it through those processes and the multiple layers of different clinical trials in order to demonstrate efficacy to be able to be approved through the market. And there's good reasons that those processes were put into place. They're really designed to understand all of the underlying biology, the potential side effects, and make sure that the drugs that were reaching patients were as safe and effective as possible. But in this new frontier of being able to target specific attributes at a molecular level of a cancer cell, the treatment effects were completely changing. So you would see for some of these first-in-human trials a really unprecedented level of activity that may not have been seen in that cancer before. And this was happening with greater frequency, really due in part to a better understanding of the underlying biology of cancer. And what it really needed was a shift in the paradigm, so that for these medicines that were displaying a really remarkable effect very early in their development, that they wouldn't have to go through the same laborious process that a general type of medicine would. So what we were able to do is work with a number of stakeholders across the government, elected officials within Congress, to be able to devise a new law, a new program that would recognize that when these scientific discoveries were made, they could essentially be fast-tracked. They would be identified by the Food and Drug Administration, and this would instigate a cross-sector collaboration in order to deliver these new medicines as rapidly as possible. And with this breakthrough therapy designation, we've now seen hundreds of drugs that have made it to market much faster and be able to be accessible by those patients who needed them most and didn't have time to wait. On average, the designation has been able to reduce the development times by nearly 3 years as compared to those products that don't have the designation. So I think it really shows the power of policy and the policy of working together toward a common goal and aligning systems in a way that's really geared more toward the end user, to the people who are ultimately going to benefit from these drugs.
Thank you. Ultimately, earlier access saves lives, and it's so impactful. Pat, I am really, really sorry about Max. We were chatting a little bit before today's discussion and the disease of chronic myelogenous leukemia, we now have one of these targeted therapies for, and it's important to understand it's really like a lock and key. Whereas before we were giving a chemotherapy-like medicine that really didn't target the biology, we now have a specific medicine that alters the biology of this disease in a way that patients can have remissions that last for years and years, and they live essentially relatively normal lives during that period with these chronic therapies. So I had the opportunity to meet one of the inventors of this medicine once, and the question that I had for him was, how many patients did it take before you understood what you had on your hands? And he thought about that for a minute, and then he said, I think 30. Once we had treated 30 patients, we were really comfortable that we had something special and that we understood what was happening. So Jeff, in the context of your comments, I think about, well, how much time elapsed between patient 30 and ultimate market access for this drug? And really, that's what we're trying to do, is to close that gap. Now, Pat, going back to the Max Foundation, we have a collaboration between BeiGene and the Max Foundation. I can say that that is a source of great pride for the people who work at our organization. The medicines that we have discovered, we feel strongly are for everyone, right? We didn't discover medicines for a particular person or a particular group of people. We really want them to be accessible everywhere. And that's why we're so grateful for the collaboration, which helps us to improve access to our medicines. And wondering if you could just talk a little bit more about how Max has made that journey from the first patient to now 100,000 patients and sustaining that impact.
Yeah, thank you. In fact, the story is that in the year 2000, we received one of those emails on behalf of a young 22-year-old from Honduras who had just been diagnosed with chronic myeloid leukemia. He was told there was a compound in development, and I had heard, because I was just saying, at those days when the data started coming out on the importance of this new drug, patients were giving each other their cell phone number of the researcher that was doing the work in Portland, Oregon, and everybody was so excited. So, Raul was patient zero for us. This is how we contacted the company, and, after helping Raul, we were able to help 100,000 people. But I always say, I don't do anything. I am not a doctor. I am not a drug manufacturer. What I do is try to bring everybody together that can make this happen so that people around the world can have access to these drugs. And so we have a huge partnership. We call it a humanitarian pact, because nobody has to do this. It's not required, but it's just the human thing to do to help others. And so a part of our humanitarian pact, we work with 500 or so hematologists and oncologists that work in the countries where the patients are, the most senior oncologists in the countries. We work with experts and group of experts in the disease. And of course, a very important piece of all these are the companies that are developing these drugs that can provide them to us so that we can bring them to the patients. I'm an advocate for patients. I'm very strong and tough sometimes on industry when they don't do the right thing, but I'm also want to recognize when companies do the right thing, because what's very important about BeiGene and the drug that you all have developed for chronic lymphocytic leukemia that is making such a huge difference in the lives of patients is that the moment that this drug got approved in the US and other major markets, we were able to have it available to patients in Nepal and in Ethiopia and Armenia and other places in the world. And that's the vision, right? That's what health equity means to me, that the life of a person in a country like Nepal has the same value, and that we care as much for them. So I feel very grateful for the partnership that we have, and my vision is that every company will work with us in this way to really understand. Everybody likes to say they're patient-centric, and everybody likes to say that they believe in health equity, but what does that mean? It means that to the extent possible, you make it available everywhere in the world. So I'm really grateful for that.
Thank you. And again, we're grateful for that collaboration. Authentically, part of the reason why I joined BeiGene, in addition to the innovation, the desire to discover these new medicines for patients for cancer, is our really deep and authentic commitment to global patient access. And that's not just global access when we're talking about emerging markets. Also, there's access challenges here in the United States, traditionally underserved communities. There's also substantial access in rural communities where patients can have substantial distance between them and their nearest oncology provider. So, distribution and access is not just an international problem, but indeed it's a US problem as well. Our CEO, John Euler, likes to say, or has said, that where you live should not determine what medicines that you have access to. And we think that that's really one of our North Stars. And other examples of that include that of these medicines that we have taken all the way to approval, we have worked not only to achieve approvals, but also effective market access in countries like Indonesia, in Thailand, in India, countries where other sponsors might not have put in the same effort or may have passed over, shall we say. But to move on and talk a little bit about some of the challenges and opportunities that we have in terms of distribution and access. I think one, shall we say, provocative example was brought forward by the recent COVID pandemic that we had. And that was truly a terrible event. And in that context, it really shone a bright light on some of the challenges that we have within our healthcare system. So 2 examples that I'll mention. So one relates to diagnostic testing. So the ability to rapidly develop a new test, the ability to distribute that new test, and then most importantly, for patients where we had to obtain a nasal swab or a blood test and then send that off to a lab and then get that result back to the patient with appropriate medical counseling, that proved to be extremely difficult around the world. The second challenge that became clear was related to what we call supply chain, that when there's a medicine that becomes available, how do you make that medicine, again, available to patients? And there were particular challenges in what we call cold chain, or a requirement that there be continuous refrigeration throughout the entire process so that we could feel confident that the medicine would retain its benefit to the patient when they finally received it. So again, this is one example that was instructive insofar as, shall we say, finding really some of the pain points in the system that can focus our attention. But Pat, I'm wondering if you could talk about your perspectives on some of the challenges and opportunities in non-traditional markets outside of, say, the United States or Europe.
Yeah, thank you. The work we do is very, very hard. Almost impossible, but not impossible. Because, a few years ago, I sat down and I thought, okay, I'm just going to write some of the barriers that, to bring access to cancer treatment anywhere in the world. And I think in 10 minutes, I came up with 26 barriers. Starting by these medicines don't get even registered in these countries. Even if you have money, how do you buy it if it's not registered or commercialized? So that's the first thing. The regulatory environment, the health authorities to make sure drugs are safe for patients have so many regulations that make it super hard to bring it, even when you're bringing it free of charge. In some countries, humanitarian donations are illegal. You can do that. Or they want to tax. You bring a drug to a country and you're going to give it to the citizens of that country, but they want you to pay import taxes on the drugs. That's another big hurdle. And then, of course, there's the issue of diagnostics. Nobody wants to diagnose a patient to actually not have any treatment. So before you bring treatment, there is no access to any of these diagnostics. And since these drugs are getting very specific on the targets, years ago I met, the first physician I met that was a partner physician from us, he was from Ethiopia. And at the time, we were helping 200 people in Ethiopia have access to an amazing medicine. And so I said to him, I'm so grateful to play a small role in bringing this treatment to these 200 people in your country. And he looked at me with a very kind face, and he said, we are very grateful. He said, I want you to understand, for the 200 patients that are in the program, I have 400 others that don't have a house to sell, so they can come up with $600, so they can send their blood to Germany, so that we can confirm the diagnosis, so they can go into your program. And that seemed to me absolutely insane and impossible, and I thought, we have to fix this problem. So diagnostics is a very big problem. But our patients sometimes don't have the money for the bus. They can't keep coming to the treatment because they don't have the money for the bus. Last year I was in Ethiopia and I was meeting a patient, and he had come that day to get his checkup, and he said to the doctor, "Doctor, I want you to understand." He said, when my appointment is coming, I get very anxious. And I thought he's going to say that he's anxious to know what's happening with his treatment. But he said, I have 5 children. I make $30 a month. I'm a driver, make $30 a month. When I have to come to this hospital, I feel I'm taking the bread out of my children's mouth. And that day he said, this is the last time I'm coming. I'm abandoning my treatment. And we were lucky enough that we had just started a program to give small grants to patients to pay for the bus. So, all the way to stigma. Stigma is a huge problem in many of these countries. So the problems are many. However, if we all pull together, we definitely can help by creating this whole infrastructure around the patient. But you can imagine what happened when COVID hit and all the countries closed down and everybody was locked in their homes. And we had about 34,000 patients in about 70 countries that we needed to make sure had access to the drug and who could not leave their homes. So it was a moment. But, COVID taught us so many things that sometimes we seem to be forgetting very quickly right now. But one of the first things it taught us is that whatever we thought was impossible was actually possible, right? So one of the things we had trouble with before was telemedicine. In these countries, telemedicine did not exist. You had to go to the doctor. When immediately telemedicine was a thing, and that's something that even now we still continues. Electronic prescriptions. In India, we had fought for years that can we have electronic prescriptions? And they said no. Well, when COVID hit, within a week, electronic prescriptions are possible. So, a lot of things are possible. And then the patients could not leave their homes to go to the hospital. So we said, how do we bring the treatment to the patients' homes? And, together with, I think in Rwanda, they were using drones to bring the medicine to patients' homes. In some countries, the police was delivering the medicine, the army, the firefighters. We managed to keep everybody on drug just because when you bring the treatment, people will do whatever they need to do to make sure the patients can have it. So lots of lessons, and I think the biggest lessons that I want to remember today from COVID is that we're all in this together. Even if we want to try to ignore that fact, we're all interconnected in the world, and we need each other. And so, that's something that I think today is very important to remember.
Thank you again, Pat. And Jeff, I think in terms of opportunities, I am aware that Friends has really embraced and is really a driver behind using emerging technologies to not only speed the regulatory process, but also improve access to patients. If you could talk about some of these emerging technologies and the potential impact they could have for patients.
Sure. So at the end of the day, of course, it is about identifying the right medicines that can benefit people and getting it to them. But as the technology of the medicines become more complicated, so too does sort of the surrounding technologies. And I think there's a lot of opportunity here. You mentioned the challenges associated with diagnostic testing that may be required. For these targeted therapies, patients undergo really complicated molecular tests in order to identify whether they're a potential candidate for a drug. The entire genome of their tumor may be sequenced in order to identify molecular alterations that can then be fit with a drug that can directly impact the growth of that cancer cell. But you need to have access to those genome screening technologies, and that's a huge challenge. Right now, in this country alone, 80% of patients are seen at a non-academic center. Many of them may not have access to this type of sequencing that's needed to be able to identify a treatment that could be beneficial to them. So a project that we've been working on is to try and help promote the adoption of new technologies. And while genomic sequencing is the underlying basis of a lot of these medicines, there's new technologies that are coming online that are capable of identifying molecular alterations in different ways. So when you think about a traditional cancer patient when they get diagnosed, they get a biopsy. The biopsy is read by a pathologist, a doctor who essentially takes a section of their tumor, stains it with a certain stain that enables them to see the morphology and the shape of the cells under a microscope, and that's been the basis of diagnosis for decades. The shape of that cell may tell you what type of cancer it is in order to then, at that point, determine what the treatment is. But what's been able to happen with the advent of improved pattern recognition through artificial intelligence, these same types of slides from a biopsy have been able to be digitized, essentially scanned and put into computer images, millions of them fed into computer software recognition through artificial intelligence to be able to recognize the changes in these cell shapes that are reflective of the underlying molecular alteration. So these types of biopsies that have been done for decades are much more accessible to patients around the world, and even if the genomic medicine is not. But through these digital pathology tools, we may be able to make the molecular-based medicine much more accessible to people who don't have access to that high-tech genomic sequencing. But in order to get there, there needs to be a concerted effort. You can imagine all of these companies that have the capability working individually to sort of forge their way forward, to understand what they need to do to develop the technology better, to make sure it's accurate, to demonstrate to the regulatory authorities that it is actually accurate in identifying the right patients, and then having to go out and find the patients who could benefit from it. But if we can all work together, and we forged a partnership with 10 different companies that have these types of tools to very rapidly validate the accuracy of their tests and make sure that this type of medicine is more widespread and ultimately get these new drugs that are targeting their cancers available to these patients in an entirely different way. And I hope this does have global ramifications because we've certainly seen a slow adoption of molecular-based medicine that this could very rapidly increase.
Great. Well, thank you both very much. We have plenty of time left, and that was by design. It was our intent to leave plenty of time for audience Q&A, so again, we can tap into the energy in the room. There will be a mic, so we would ask anybody who has a question to just put up your hand. We can bring the mic to you so that you can ask your question and everyone can hear it clearly. Again, thank you for your time today. Jeff and Pat, we'll have a couple more minutes, but thank you so much for sharing your insights. Any audience questions? I have a
Is it on? Can you hear me? Hi, I'm John. Thank you so much. Really appreciate your example with the pandemic, for example, of like how supply chain is very difficult. I'm interested to know in that sort of way where you have all these interlocutors, especially outside the United States, to get medicine to folks. If you need more people like him outside the States to create policy so that you can deliver these more complex kind of like medications that require refrigeration, for example, or policy to change, because I heard you say that they have taxes and stuff like for donation, and while I get that on like a food level, I don't think that really makes sense on like a medicine level, because it's very difficult to create like a localized economy on reselling drugs.
Yeah. Pat, do you have
Thoughts?
anything?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I mean, definitely lots of people working, especially in Africa, to consolidate regulatory systems to be, one of the reasons that companies don't register their drugs in many of the countries is it's very expensive, it's very complicated, and it takes many years. So we're trying to bring everybody together to be able to have, let's say, one regulatory pathway for a continent or subcontinent or a group of countries, and I think that's very important. Supply chains are a big problem in many places, and we're constantly trying to consolidate and elevate the health system to be able to bring this technology faster to these countries. But yeah, it's a very good question, and there's a lot of people trying to change, but change is always hard for everyone, especially in policy.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Maybe to detail a point that you made earlier, just for clarity for the audience, the system that we have in the United States, in a way, is the exception rather than the rule, that once you have regulatory approval, then there's market access. In most countries around the world, there's a second step where you have to negotiate with the local authorities related to access through government systems and other systems. So this does create additional time and complexity requirements. But really, our experience broadly is that, of course, stakeholders in those countries want these medicines to be available. They don't want their population to not have access to life-sustaining medicines, whether they're for cancer, for COVID, or what have you. It just takes a little bit of time and effort to work with those stakeholders and pragmatically figure out a path of how can we make that happen.
It often feels like there's a little bit of a disconnect in terms of how you find out about new medicines. And if you look at innovation and how that's happening across the industry for consumer marketing goods, obviously we all know about Apple. They're really good at teaching about what products are released, but in the pharma industry, that's only really done through your doctor or when you reach that point. Is there any innovative way that you've seen companies are trying to help showcase what's available to you? Because you're really at the mercy of how good your doctor is, the drugs that he knows about. Is there any way that individual people could be marketed to in a more creative, innovative way?
Jeff, is there anything you'd like to say? I'm happy to speak to this as well.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. You are subject to the experience and expertise of physicians, especially in a highly specialized field like oncology. And I think that's another issue surrounding access, is ensuring that all patients have access to a healthcare provider who has enough expertise about that field to ensure that they get the right medicine. I think one area that maybe could be built on is around efforts that have been made even before a drug is available. So in the clinical trial space, there's been significant efforts, and I think a lot more work that needs to be done in order to help identify new systems that can essentially match a patient to a potential therapy and make sure that the clinical trial is then accessible to them wherever they're being treated. So there's two big barriers there. Some of that goes back to diagnosis and ensuring that diagnosis is being able to be matched to where there is a potential available therapy. And I think that improved efforts around alignment of even electronic health records that can be able to instantaneously identify when a diagnosis is entered into that record, how it can match a patient to either a treatment or a clinical trial that is best fit for them, can really take that knowledge gap away, and hopefully improve the access gap as well. But I think these have proven to be big challenges. And then I think the second step of that is accessibility. Again, back to the idea that oftentimes clinical trials are only available at a small subset of hospitals around the country, largely academic centers. And there's good reasons for that, but for many types of medicines, as they're being better understood, they can be available, as Pat described, directly brought to the patient. And being able to identify and close those logistical barriers that unfortunately still exist, I think is a very laudable goal that we all need to come together and work toward.
So it's a really interesting and important question. There's multiple facets to it. I think that the internet has really democratized access to information. When I was a clinician several years ago, I would often see patients for a second opinion who had downloaded a lot of information and had read a lot of information. And there were patients I see who really understood in great depth and detail specific facets around their diagnosis. But I think that ultimately most of those folks still needed some help with synthesis of information. So there's that piece. Now, you are correct that the US, again, is a little bit unusual in that we have direct-to-consumer advertising, the ads that you see on the television. As a physician, sometimes I worry a little bit about, does the fact that you happen to see an ad while you're watching a basketball game, does that steer you towards one therapy or another that might or might not be totally constructive? Another technology that's emerging right now is that if you do a Google search for a certain diagnosis, you might notice certain ads popping up in your browser related to that individual search. So I think that, credit to the FDA. I think that they have really advocated for and have done a really nice job in terms of plain language summaries to have more non-commercial, totally unbiased information available to patients. I do think that conversation with a patient's physician provider is really important to help to integrate and synthesize all that information and help to arrive at a best treatment option in that individual case.
Hi, Pat. Sorry. So you mentioned with these medicines trying to get them into these other countries. Can you explain the journey with talking with government officials and how you nurture those relationships and just trying to get them in the country within in the first place?
Yeah, thank you so much. Of course, the ministries of health and the health authorities of these countries are really an important partner of our work. And in all the countries where we're working, we are very in close communication with the Ministry of Health because these drugs are not tested or registered in these countries. Even before we bring any shipment of drug, we need the Ministry of Health to give us a permit for that physician to be able to use the drug in those for those patients. So we keep very close contact with ministries of health, and we are committed in the long term. But the dream and the goal is that eventually these economies are ready to actually take responsibility for providing these medicines to the patients. So we work closely with them to make sure that we, as we bring these drugs, we build a healthcare system, that the government becomes a very important sort of contributor. But the reality is that in many countries, especially cancer, is always like the last piece of what they can support, because they have so many other areas that they have to support. So we work very closely with them. One of the challenges we have sometimes is political instability. I think we are all very aware what happens when a government changes, or we develop a relationship with the Ministry of Health, and then the Ministry of Health leaves, and then somebody else comes that has a very different idea. So we're constantly having to make sure that we are working with the local authorities to make sure that we're partnering with them in the treatment of patients.
Well, maybe I'll ask another question. So if you could each look into your crystal ball of how you think things might evolve and what you think we could see or what you hope to see in, say, the next 3 to 5 years in terms of access and distribution, innovation in those domains.
Sure. I hope we'll continue to see the pace of developing new medicines increase. And that's going to require leveraging new technologies in different ways than perhaps we've done in the past. In some ways, many cancers have benefited from the development of new therapies. It doesn't mean that the unmet need isn't still there, however. Even with life-extending therapies, many patients, of course, will relapse. Their tumors will change. They'll develop other forms of cancer. So the unmet need remains. But because some of these initial therapies are so effective, it actually takes longer to develop the next generation of new medicines. But I think that's where technology can come in. One of the largest projects that we're funding and running currently now is looking at a new molecular measure that can indicate whether a treatment is working earlier than is currently possible. And it evaluates genetic fragments that can be found in the blood called circulating tumor DNA. Many tumors shed this genetic information, and it can be readily measured with blood testing technology today. And what we've shown through a partnership with over a dozen pharmaceutical companies that have dropped competition, that have been willing to share data from their clinical trials in order to figure out a better way to move things forward faster, is that reduction of these ctDNA molecules following treatment correlates with improvements in overall survival. And while understanding and measuring overall survival for many cancers may take years, what we've been able to show from this initial data is that changes in ctDNA can identify a beneficial compound within the first 10 weeks of treatment. So being able to identify those beneficial treatments in a matter of weeks instead of months or years, I think has the ability to transform the future of development and hopefully continue to speed access to patients.
Thank you. We are doing a lot, and I've been very happy to share our experience and our successes. Of course, there's a lot. The unmet need is huge. We need a lot more help. One of the things that we're looking at is, within the data systems that we have created, what can AI give us to supercharge our ability to help more patients? And but we need a lot more stakeholders to come to the partnership, and we're definitely looking at galvanizing the community to be able to, I would like to see more drugs available for patients that we can bring. We're starting, not only the program with Beijing on this chronic lymphocytic leukemia, but, we are starting to tackling breast cancer. And we need anybody that has anything to help with, increasing survival of breast cancer in low and middle income countries to come and help us out. And I don't want to leave this today without calling out the moment that we're living in global health. It's a difficult moment. There's a lot of change. There's a lot of disruption, and I think that a few months ago I would have given a very different answer from what I'm giving today, because it's a little bit difficult to know where things are going, and how can we continue to understand that we need to help the most vulnerable in the world and it's in our best interest. I think that John Euler and myself wrote an op-ed a couple of years ago, I think. And the first sentence said, leaving half the world behind cannot be good for business. And I think that that's something that we have to remember, that we have to all rise together, and that's possible to do. So because we can, we should.
Thank you. And perhaps keeping with the music theme of this conference, I'll riff on a couple of the points that you just made. So both of you made reference to the ongoing unmet medical need, which is really, really a critical consideration. So again, going back 20 years when I was a clinical trainee, there are some diseases that are really totally transformed in how we're managing them. But unfortunately, there are other diseases where that's not the case. The way we treat pancreatic cancer, most cases of colon cancer, aggressive brain tumors is pretty much unchanged in the last 20 years. So there is a huge need for continued innovation. We and many other companies are deeply committed to leveraging emerging technologies, leveraging the science to accelerate discoveries that will continue to improve outcomes for patients with cancer. I think that's really the critical piece, and most of what I do in my day-to-day job is designing and delivering those clinical trials. Now, to the point about AI, which has a lot of promise and is something that we're really excited about, really when we're talking about AI within my domain, the pharmaceutical industry and the development world, really what we're talking about is technical automation. And there's so many pieces of what we do in terms of writing documents, how we reach out, how we analyze data, how we collect data that can be partially or fully automated. This has two really important benefits, is that one, it's another accelerant. It allows us to progress early phase and late phase clinical studies faster. And two, it ultimately also reduces the cost. And by reducing cost, it can help with affordability and enable global access. So Jeff and Pat, I don't know if you have any additional thoughts on how AI is impacting the work that you do within your organizations.
I think it still remains to be seen in many ways. We're probably just on the tip of the iceberg of how some emerging technologies will be able to transform healthcare more generally. From our vantage point, I think trying to identify the necessary policies needs to happen now, so that those systems are in place in order to enable efficient development and clarity into the process, to make sure that we're not putting artificial delays on these types of technologies. And they're coming so quickly that I think this, now is the opportunity to identify what those processes need to be, so we're not trying to fix the system later.
For us, it's a lot about supply chains, and I think that AI can do a lot to help us planning and forecasting and make sure that there's no stockouts anywhere. Is very complicated, and this is something that AI can really help us model. And then the other piece that it's a little bit difficult to see the relationship, but climate change is making things very difficult for us, because we are seeing extreme temperatures in places that we didn't expect to see. And so, sometimes when we're shipping drug from point A to point B, and medicines need to be kept at a certain temperature, we're seeing these big spikes of either too hot or too cold, and then these medicines cannot be used. So we're trying to use AI to do to mix the climate models with the sort of supply chains and all our plans to make sure that drugs can arrive safely and be used safely by patients. So that's the biggest area where I think AI can really help us.
Great. Well, if there's no further questions, I would like to thank you all again for joining us today and participating in our conversation. Pat and Jeff, thank you both very much for your time. We really value the collaboration that we have together, and hopefully convey that by working together, we can do more to address inequities in distribution and access, and to help bring life-sustaining and life-saving medicines to patients more effectively. Thank you all. Have a great day.